Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is going to be a webinar all about heat. So we are, apologize for the slight delay, just trying to get some of the technical things sorted out behind the scenes. So I appreciate your patience. So this is going to be a continuation of our webinar series we started back in I think April of 2020. We have we did webinars based on COVID-19 specific updates and things to the law. We have started shifting away into more general webinar, tenant landlord law information guides, that sort of thing, while also talking about updates and such. So myriad of topics. Today's topic is all about heat. It is getting cold out there. I know we just had 80 degrees this past weekend, but heat is still a very timely subject, I think. So we will be getting into that. We will be joined by Matt Eichenlaub, who is a housing attorney here at Homeline. He's been doing this for 15 years now.
14.
14 still. Okay.
Yeah.
I wasn't certain when 15 hit, so.
It'll hit. Yeah.
But Matt's been doing this for 14 years, so he's definitely a subject matter expert, I would say, on this. If you have questions about heat or anything related to today's topic, feel free to drop those in the Q&A. Or if you have general questions related to landlord-tenant law, we will do our best to answer those. Again, Matt's got a lot of experience. I have a lot of COVID-19 specific experience, and a fair amount of experience at this point with regular housing law stuff. So again, if you can use the Q&A function that is at the bottom of the screen, I will be monitoring that. I will, the chat itself, I just have a hard time monitoring. So the Q&A function is the best way to go about that. We will have time for Q&A at the end of this presentation. So again, without further ado, we will move along to the quick update about what is Homeline. This is us. So we are a nonprofit organization. We've been around about 30 years. We help tenants specifically here in Minnesota try to navigate what their rights are and just the general world of landlord-tenant law. So if you're a tenant and you have questions about your rights as a tenant, we do offer our hotline in 4 languages, Spanish, Somali, Hmong, and English. We also have an email and attorney option where you can email an attorney for free by going to our website, homelinemn.org, and then in the upper right hand corner, there's an email and attorney link that you can use if you'd like to email us. Otherwise, that's our phone number on the screen as well. All right. So then that is it for me. I'm going to turn it over to Matt. So thank you so much for being here. And again, if you've got questions, drop them in that Q&A.
All right. Thank you, Rachel. I missed a chance to be witty. April 1st is my anniversary date, so the joke will be on me when it hits the 15-year anniversary. Okay, so I could see you're all lukewarm on that humor. Hey, let's talk about heat. So heat calls, it's an annual tradition. This is something that comes up in our office every year. We get heat calls and we all have to refresh our memory on what the rules are surrounding heat. And this year we decided, hey, why don't we do a webinar? That would be a great idea. And so that's what we're doing. It's an annual tradition. Like I say, the earliest calls tend to be in September. I took a look at some of the historical numbers here. 2019, we had our first heat call was in August 28th of 2019. That was more of a general question about when does the landlord have to turn on the furnace? Not exactly, it was too cold in the unit. Otherwise, 2020, September 7th, and 2021, September 21st. So those are sort of the times when we start to get calls from tenants saying, hey, it's really cold and it's too cold. I think this year it was cold. There was a snap when it was really cold a few weeks ago, but then last week it was really warm, and that's just the way the weather it is, right? It sort of it ebbs and it flows, ever down and then up again. The latest calls tend to be in May, May 20th, May 10th, May 28th, 2021. We had a call. That's pretty late for it to be cold. And these are, parts of the state that are more north than here. It stays colder longer. I don't know how many lines of latitude we're talking about, but it's several. And it tends to be longer. Winter tends to be longer there. So really, it ends up being a pretty long season for heat calls from September to May. And it's just good to be refreshed on these things, and that's what we're talking about today. Most of what we talk about today will be heat calls in the context of it's too cold. We aren't going to talk about air conditioning much. I'll talk about it a little bit now. We don't really mark air conditioning calls as heat calls in the same way. They fall under sort of different rules. There aren't any state ordinances or city ordinances or state statutes dealing with air conditioning. It more falls into sort of these general duty of repair issues. Whereas with heat, there are a lot of different citywide ordinances to deal with. And that's one reason why we have to focus on heat calls so much, is because the rules vary from city to city. We have on our website a database. It's a few years old. It isn't something we update every year, but most cities in Minnesota are logged into this database, and the information is accurate from when we put them in. I want to say it was 2018. That feels like an awful long time ago. Heat code doesn't change too frequently, so that's good. But that's a good resource to check out. You can check it out on our website. Just Googling Homeline heat code should bring you to the right page. All right. So where are the rules, right? There are rules about heat code. So where are the rules? These are going to be city ordinances. And the city ordinances set up I sort of box them into three different types of codes. One is sort of this fixed date method, where the heat code is enforced on this date, and that's when it is. The other is sort of a variable date method where it depends on the temperature. And the last one is sort of this year-round code where the code is always in force. There is no statewide ordinance at this point. That's something that has been up for debate at the legislature, but as of right now, it's something that varies city to city. I certainly have opinions on that. They vary from musings to ramblings, and so I don't know how much you want to hear about me talk about heat ordinances, but there is no statewide ordinance yet. If you think there should be, you can call your legislator and say it would be a great idea. 504B161 is sort of a default. What this statute is it talks about the landlord's general duty of repair. The covenants of habitability is what it's called. It says the landlord needs to keep the property fit for the use intended and in reasonable repair, compliant with local health and safety ordinances. And so that is really one source of authority saying, yes, you do have to follow these city laws. Not only are they city laws, but also in sort of a more vague sense, right? To keep the place fit for the use intended in reasonable repair. Even without a heat ordinance for a city, if it's February, you have no furnace, well, that's not fit for the use intended. That's not reasonable repair. That's not working how it should work. It's not livable in a way that we think something should be livable. So those are really the sources of laws, are the city ordinances, and then the statewide sort of general covenant of habitability. So a lot of this is sort of generalizing and condensing down a lot of various codes, right? There are a lot of different cities in Minnesota, right? Like there's a lot. And so a lot of this is sort of generalizing down into these ideas, these commonalities that they have. And so what do these codes tend to require? Capable of maintaining some minimum temperature. Usually that's between 65 and 70 degrees. Again, this varies city by city, but that's usually what they require. Um, Oftentimes there's an exception for extremely cold weather. Usually when it hits, minus 20, the heat code kind of goes out the window, as it were. The code won't, it makes allowances for it being extremely cold. What are some outliers? St. Paul has some repair and deduct language. There's some language that allows a tenant to make repairs to the furnace and deduct those costs off of the rent if it's too cold, if the landlord isn't making the repairs. Some other ordinances are very specific about what rooms need to be heated. Again, these are sort of outliers. They're notable, especially the St. Paul language is notable because it, I think, is the only one that allows the repair and deduct. It's notable because it's the second largest city in Minnesota. Repair and deduct without a court process is extremely extremely rare in Minnesota. It's extremely unusual. Normally to repair and deduct, you need a court order to do that. So that's interesting that the St. Paul ordinance allows for it. All right. Okay. So let's talk about these sort of three different types of methods we talked about that I mentioned in passing. The first one is this fixed date method. I call it that because I don't have any other better name for it. I didn't put any extra time in thinking about a snappy name. But this is what it's about, is that there's a fixed date when the ordinance is into effect, and there's a fixed date when it goes out of effect. And some cities that use this: Eden Prairie, St. Paul, St. Cloud, Virginia. These are some common windows that are in effect, right? October 1st to May 30th, the heat code is in effect. September 1st to June 1st, October 15th to April 15th. And those sort of line up with our earliest and latest calls, right? We're talking about September, mid to late September as when we get our first call, talking about mid to late May when we get our last call. So it lines up a little bit. Minneapolis is interesting in this fixed date method because they have sort of a tiered system. From October to April 30th, you must be able to keep it at 68 degrees. But in that zone from September 15th to September 30th, the requirement is to keep it at 65. So it's this sort of easing into the full heat code, and then again, easing out of it from May 1st to May 15th. It's an interesting way to do the heat code. And I think that's one thing that is interesting about this. I don't know. We talk about states as laboratories for democracy, right? Like states do the laws in their own different ways. And so it's interesting from certainly in an observation point of view to see how different cities deal with the different heat code issues, right? Minneapolis and St. Paul, for all intents and purposes, have the same weather, right? The only thing that separates them is Highway 280. So it's interesting to me that they have these different approaches. And that's the approach that Minneapolis has chosen, was a sort of tiered approach. Again, I've got musings and I've got ramblings, and I don't know which is which. Okay. So the second type is called this variable method. It's not something that's pinned down to a precise date. It depends on the weather. Rochester is the one that springs to mind. Rosemount, Thief River Falls, Shakopee are a couple of them. The heat code is in effect whenever the temperature is below 60 degrees. The Rochester ordinance makes it a point to say 60 degrees at the Rochester airport on any given day. Then the heat is in effect. The weather changes from week to week, from day to day. You could get snow in June, I guess, right? Like that could happen. And so this is an interesting method because it relies on the facts on the ground rather than some sort of date on the calendar, right? The calendar method is nice because it's predictable, right? You know exactly what day it is. But is it that usable for how the weather is for those outlying days? That's the question that, again, that's why it's so interesting, how different cities address it. Um, yeah, but that's really the variable method, is that it's just a different way of responding to it. And then there's the year-round method. Bloomington, Fridley, Lakeville, Richfield, Worthington. Again, these aren't really small towns by any means, right? Bloomington, I think, is the fifth largest city in the state. Rochester, the third, maybe. Maintain a temperature of 68 degrees throughout the year. There's no sort of distinction between May 31st and June 1st, right? What's the difference between those dates is one way to think about it, right? There is none, practically. The question is that the ordinance should be in effect year round, is how they've got this one set up. And so, yeah, must be capable of maintaining a temperature of 68 degrees throughout the year. And that's the year-round method. So those are three different ways to approach the problem, right? And it's interesting because they both are aimed at the same thing. How do we ensure tenants have a livable and usable space? Space that's honestly safe. And I don't know, it's really interesting how cities have decided that. There's no citywide heat code, or there's no statewide heat code. I don't know what a statewide heat code would look like. Would it be the year-round method? It's not a bad idea. Would it be more of the fixed term? I don't know that either. That's neither do the legislators, and maybe that's why we are here without a heat code, a statewide heat code. But that's, again, something different. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so how cold is too cold, right? We've got these rules in place. The landlord should keep the property at a particular temperature. You know, how cold is too cold? I think it's important to talk about how it feels isn't enough, that you really need to measure. You need this objective view of what the temperature is. Ultimately, if you get in a dispute with your landlord about the temperature and you can't resolve it between the two of you, then you either drop it or you file in court and have a judge make a ruling on who's right and who's wrong and what the temperature should be. And if you get to court, the judge isn't going to be terribly concerned about how it feels, if it feels too cold, because that's subjective. That varies from person to person. In the evening, my wife and I will watch TV, and I'll be in 3 sweaters and she will be in a t-shirt. It's the same temperature for both of us. We trade chairs sometimes, so it's not the draft. It's not a drafty spot, right? But it's the same temperature, and so you need this objective reading, and that means a thermometer. I tend to think of it, the temperature being below 60, as close as an emergency, that is time to file an emergency tenant remedy action. Above 60 degrees, I think of that as more of sort of the non-emergency repair process. The rent escrow action, most times when people call Homeline with repair issues, most of the time we're talking about a rent escrow, a non-emergency repair. You give the landlord a letter telling them of the repair issue, asking them to fix it within 14 days. If it's not fixed in 14 days, you could file a court case. You pay your rent to court instead of to the landlord. You have a hearing in front of a judge, and the judge decides what's broken, who should fix it, should the tenant get compensation back, can the tenant make the repairs, deduct it off the rent. Those sorts of issues are resolved. It takes a little bit longer, especially compared to an emergency tenant remedy action. That is what it sounds like. It's a much more summary proceeding. The notice requirement is less. To file an ETRA, the tenant needs to give the landlord a 24-hour notice. And you can imagine, right? It's January, it's 50 degrees in the house. I don't need to wait 2 weeks to file this case, right? You shouldn't be expected to live like that. And so you can file this emergency tenant remedy action. You're able to give the landlord a 24-hour notice that they need to fix it within 24 hours, or you'll file the case. You file it, you usually get a court hearing within, I would say, 2, 3, 4 business days. You're in front of a judge, which is it's pretty tough to get in front of a judge any faster than that in this judicial system. It's just really tough to get faster than that. The ETRA, you can use it for heat. Statute talks about heat. It talks about, no running water, no toilets, no sanitary facilities, no electricity. And so it really is for these sort of emergency things, these real essential services. And that's kind of that's sort of in my mind, what I have as below 60 and above 60 is that cutoff point. There's nothing in law that says that. That's just me kind of making an argument. Could 62 be worthy of an emergency tenant remedy action? Sure. If you can convince a judge, it certainly could be. But that's sort of my read on it. So how do you measure?
We're going to try something a little different today.
Yeah.
So if you have been with us before, this is new technology. So I'm hoping this works. I checked. We have, Matt was nice enough to make a video for us. So Matt, let me know if you can't hear this.
All right.
There isn't any sound to begin with, but then you'll come in, all right? Can you hear it?
I don't hear it yet.
Oh, shoot. All right. There was supposed to be noise there.
That's okay. I can grab the...
Can you see it?
I see it. Yep, I see it.
Okay.
I remember all my lines. I can talk along, lip sync it.
You might have to.
I think I have.
All right. Let's see.
Quickly even grab my prompts too.
It doesn't give me audio. Yeah, okay. Well, this might be a slight problem. I thought it would work, but it didn't. Okay, so Matt, if you can kind of give us a play-by-play, I guess.
I sure can. So here is the part where we open and I blink too much. No, this is just me introducing the idea of what we're going to do. I kind of talked about some of this earlier. The importance of measuring. That's a really great color for me. Thanks. The importance of measuring the temperature, that you want this objective reading so that you can show, here's how cold it was. Here's how I know it was too cold. Not that it felt too cold, but that I know it was too cold. I think I also mentioned the importance of measuring 3 feet from the floor and 3 feet from the ground. You want to do that so that you're getting a more accurate picture of the ambient air temperature that's happening. Next to the wall, it's not gonna come out right. Okay, so here I'm showing off some cool thermometers. I even have one of them right here. Ooh, here it is, the thermometer. This is like, what is it like? It's like a Smithsonian or something. And so I'm demonstrating just how to use a couple different types of thermometers. That one came from Excel Energy and like an energy efficiency kit. It's pretty good. I think I even say that. Yeah, that's a traditional one with goo in the bottom. I probably could have rotated it a little bit so you could see the red portion better. Listen to this, I'm play-by-playing. I'm second guessing everything, but that's okay. It's fine. It was $4 at Home Depot is where I found that. So it's good to have these things. Yeah, there's a Thermobob. It's a pretty good one.
That one's just a meat thermometer, right?
Yeah, that's just a meat thermometer. Yeah, I noticed a while ago that it takes the room temperature when I was like waiting to, test my roast. So, and then these are like the thermometers you use in your ear for testing your fever. They are not good for this task. They aren't calibrated to take the air temperature. So don't try to use those. Don't use a thermostat. Most of the statutes say you need to test 3 feet from the wall, 3 feet from the floor. The thermostat may not be as accurate. It's not what the statute says, for one, And for 2, it's up against the wall, and that could change things a little bit. So I recommend having a thermometer you can take from room to room. You can measure the bedroom, the living room, you can measure the bathroom, whatever, right? So that's what I recommend for that. Here I made a temperature log. You want to do this because you not only do you want to say, oh yeah, I measured the temperature a couple times and it was cold. You want to be able to have these good records. These records, I think, are really persuasive if it gets time to go to court. I think they're persuasive for showing to your landlord. So this is just a notebook, piece of notebook paper, temp log, the dates that I took the temperature. You can make fun of my handwriting. I did my dangest to write nicely. And I only took the living room temperature here. But you could take it in the bedroom number 1, bedroom number 2. You could take it outside. That might be interesting to be able to show, here's how cold it was outside, here's how cold it was inside. Here, I think I'm talking about 3 feet from the floor.
I think the important part from here is that what you're saying is that the court is going to want to know objective data. Like they're not going to know, like, it feels cold, sure, but that is a subjective thing. As you were saying with you and your wife, I'm the same way with my husband and I, like, I'm sitting here under a blanket currently in my home, and my husband is sitting in the next room over in a t-shirt. So
yeah, it's true.
Cold is one of those things that's in the eye of the beholder. So that's why it's important to have the actual objective temperature readings. So I did put a note in the chat as well, but I apologize that did not work as hoped. But it will be available. That video will be a standalone on our website as well, with sound and everything.
My wife did the cinematography. She did a great job with the camera work.
Yes.
Rachel did the editing. So it's an editor's medium. So it's really great. Yeah. I did a great job.
Thank you. But that will be available if you would like to peruse as well. You can also applaud Matt for his ukulele intro.
Thank you.
That is included.
Yes.
All right. So then let's move on to more slides. Take it away.
All right. Okay. So when it's cold, it's really cold, right? I talked about this a little bit earlier. The emergency tenant remedy action. That's the main thing you can file. You can give your landlord a 24-hour notice of repair. The court form is available through the court website. Filing fee is $285. You can get that waived depending on your income, and you'll get a hearing. You'll have to handle service of process, but you'll get a hearing where your job is to show here's how the landlord is not living up to his end of the bargain, and this is why it's an emergency, because it's 55 degrees in my apartment, right? And here's the data to back that up. And that chart that I made, that was just a notebook. That was a notebook and a pen, and I used a ruler too to make the lines nice and straight. But that's what I'd recommend doing. So you can hold that out and say, here's this recording of it. Like I say, hearing relatively quickly, 3-4 business days. That's pretty fast. When it's cold, but not that cold, we're talking about a rent escrow action. 14-day letter, over 60, I think of as maybe not an emergency in the same way. This is landlords, I feel like, should want to fix this, and they do want to fix this. No heat in a home means you're going to get frozen pipes, and that's going to cost you a lot more money, right? Like that's a real problem to have to deal with. And so most of the time, landlords do want to fix these things. This isn't something, it's the right thing to do because it's the right thing under law, but it's the right thing because you shouldn't leave people cold. But it's the self-interested thing to do because you don't want to have a frozen pipe situation either, right? So a lot of times this is just about notifying the landlord, here's what's going on, and the good landlords get it done. And this is really sort of Sometimes you get a landlord who's an absentee landlord or just not that great, or for whatever reason, nobody wants to go to court, but if you have to go to court, this is what you do. And for non-emergencies, the rent escrow is how you go to court. 14-day letter, you can file on day 15. Filing fee is $75. Usually you have a hearing in about 2 weeks in normal times. I think some counties it's a little bit slower right now because everything's backed up from this long tail of COVID still. But a lot of other counties, things are back to the normal schedule. So remedies, right? It's always a question of what can be done? What can you ask the court to do? You can ask the court to order the repair, right? On pain of contempt of court, I guess, right? The court can order repair on the duct. I mentioned it earlier, some states do have this repair and deduct written into statute. Minnesota generally does not. The St. Paul ordinance allows it. You have to give some particular notice and give some particular time for the problem to get resolved, for the landlord to resolve the problem. And then if it's not done, you can do a repair and deduct. But St. Paul is the outlier there, and I would follow that pretty closely if I was going to get involved in a repair and deduct situation. Otherwise, you need a court order, and the judge can order that. Sometimes that's the right idea for a tenant, because then you're not waiting. As a tenant, you're not waiting around for someone else to do it. You can sort of take the ball in your own hands and take the bull by the horn, or whatever cliche or metaphor you like. So sometimes that's a good option if you've got the money for it as a tenant. The court can award, and those are the other remedies. Past, future damages, right? You lost out on value because you didn't get the full value of what you were promised. If the property is 45 degrees, do you really have an obligation to sleep there at night? Maybe you have to go to a hotel. That could be part of your damages as a tenant. Appoint an administrator is one of the more extreme things the court can do. The court can say, yeah, we need a third party to take over the management of this property. I've only seen that a couple of times in my 14 years, but it does happen, and it is something you can ask for. There's another category. On the court forms, it says other, and you could check the box and say other. I don't know, whatever creativity you want to put in there, you can ask for, and the judge can decide whether to grant it or not. So we kind of said, what if, right? What if I lost the heat and used electric space heaters instead of the furnace? Or what if the landlord just provided me with electric space heaters instead of fixing the furnace? I think that's a problem because they are highly inefficient, and I don't know that they are really that safe, especially if the tenant is paying utilities. A gas furnace is going to be a lot more efficient than a bunch of electric space heaters. And if you're the tenant paying gas and paying electricity, that's coming out of your pocket, right? Like that's an increase on you. And so if you go to court, maybe you are entitled to some of that sort of excess electricity payments that you made. It may be tough to show that number, but you could compare prior year's bills, I suppose. We hear it a lot. I've had to use my oven and my stove to heat the apartment or heat the house. Incredibly dangerous, right? We hear about it every winter. There's a few fires where someone is using their furnace to heat the apartment or the house and it burns down. I mean, it's an annual occurrence, honestly. And so, yeah, that's incredibly dangerous. As a tenant, it's dangerous. As a landlord, it's dangerous because there goes your asset, right? So that's bad, right? That's really bad. What if I have to stay in a hotel? Yeah, I think you can ask for those damages. Should a person be expected to stay in a home when it's 50 degrees? I don't know. I don't think so. That's pretty unpleasant. And that's pretty unpleasant. I guess that's it. That's what I say about that. What if the pipes freeze? Yeah, that's a big problem. You're going to lose some property probably as a tenant. You're probably going to get some stuff flooded out. As a landlord, you're going to have a lot more bills to have to pay to fix the frozen pipes. It's going to be harder to stay in the unit with a flood happening. that's going to be a big problem. What if I, the tenant, just pay out of pocket, right? Outside of St. Paul, what if I just call the heating place and just pay? Can I get the money back? Maybe, probably. It may be difficult. I mean, you could try to game it out a little bit. Like I say, there's no right under statute to repair and deduct it off the next month's rent. You can do that, and sometimes it works out. You know, you pay $400 for a furnace person to come out and make an emergency repair. I don't know if that's what it costs. I'm picking numbers here, right? And so the next month you write the rent check for $400 lighter and include the invoice that's been paid. And maybe the landlord makes an issue of it, and maybe they don't. If they don't, then it's fine. It's kind of taken care of, right? Maybe you text back and forth with the landlord and get their approval to do that after the fact. I think there's an argument that you're owed the money back, right? You've done something you weren't necessarily required to do. And so there's this notion that, you should get that money back, and in fairness, right? But it's not exactly how the statute is written, although sometimes it can work out. Other what ifs? I don't know. What other what ifs do we have?
And we've got several other questions. I think this
All
is
right,
a
great.
good time for that. So we had some pre-submitted questions that I'll go through first. And then we do have some questions that came up during the session that I will ask as well. Matt, you and I can kind of go back and forth on this so that you can have a second to breathe, drink some water. Thank you so much for all of that information as well. Like, it's a lot. So please, if you have questions, we have plenty of time to pick Matt's brain about landlord-tenant law. So let's get into the pre-submitted questions. So, all right. So Tim sent this in their service provider, and they're asking, what are the minimum requirements for insulation windows, air sealing for pre-2000 buildings in Minnesota? I don't know. Do you know?
I don't. That's a very specific question. We tend not to get so involved in sort of these like building code questions, right? Your best bet is maybe to call the city. I'm not really sure. Yeah, that's a good question, but I can't answer it. Yeah.
Yeah, like, and it will, vary from city to city as to what the building codes are, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's applicable to older buildings. So, like, it's a minefield. There is a section of 504B.161. That's the statute that requires that a landlord is responsible for keeping the place reasonably maintained. That says that a landlord should also work to make sure that the place is reasonably energy efficient. So by installing like weather stripping caulkings from windows, basically to make sure that the place is more energy efficient than it was. So that's another kind of place to look at. The legislature's kind of softball into trying to get landlords into making more energy efficient upgrades so that, well, for one, that homes are warmer, safer, that they're using less energy. But that is something else to, I guess, to consider when thinking about energy efficient options and how they apply to rentals. All right, next question is, who do you contact with a complaint or to file a report on an LIHTC property? So that is a low income housing tax credit.
If this is sort of a repair issue, I think the best way to proceed is with a rent escrow. That is sort of this catch-all for any repair issue where the issue is not, where the property is not being kept fit for the use intended and in reasonable repair. That's the one that a tenant can do on their own. They don't need a lawyer to do it. you sort of, again, take the bull by the horns and send a letter in 14 days. Um, Otherwise, city housing and cities often have rental housing inspectors. Certainly can reach out to them, see if they'll inspect it. Um, Other than that, I don't know who administers the tax credits. Is it Minnesota Housing? I'm not even sure about that. So
Yeah.
that's more of like a heavy duty administrative question, I
Mhm.
guess. But if it's a repair issue, I would generally say the city rental inspector or send your own 14-day letter.
Thanks. This one's a little bit specific, so I don't know how much we'll be able to answer, but they're saying that their landlord did a full renovation of their 1900 house. No permits or licensed contractors apparently, but they're saying it's super drafty and that the tenant pays for the propane tank filling. So,
Yeah, the permits and things like that may be an issue at a city level. Um, if it's drafty, really drafty, I guess I'd make the case that that's not in reasonable repair,
mhm,
and that's something that should be fixed. That's ultimately what you'll have to show to the judge. How drafty is too drafty, right? I don't know the answer to that. That's an interesting question. Um, take some videos of some candles, I guess. I don't know. I'm spitballing here on how you prove that, but
mhm. I
yeah.
think that might be worth a phone call to us or an attorney to talk about
That's
specifics.
yeah.
All right. Three more from the pre-submitted questions. Um, can a landlord give me a lease violation if we open the windows because it's too hot in the unit?
Oh, that's a really great question. And it sort of revolves around so many different things. I guess the lease violation, the first thing I guess I'd wonder is what does the lease say, right? Is it a violation of the lease? Certainly opening the windows in winter can be a problem. It is possible to freeze pipes out or something like that if it's really cold and you do open the windows. But if it's too warm, maybe that raises a different question. Maybe that's fit for the use intended and reasonable repair, sort of from the other way, right? We've been talking about it being too cold, but if it's 88 degrees in your apartment, that is also unpleasant, right? Like temperature feels different at different times of year, right? Like we all know this, right? When it is 50 degrees that first day on March 3rd, it's shorts and t-shirts. Let's rock and roll, right? But if it's 50 degrees in August, it is deadly, right? It is awful. Nobody likes that. But still, 88, if it's extremely hot, then maybe it's a rent escrow issue that needs to be fixed. Maybe that's the real issue.
Okay. And then this one's not heat related, but a tenant, I wish to rename anonymous, just asks, is there a maximum rent increase in the southern suburbs?
No, there's no rent increase cap
Yep,
for the southern suburbs.
perfect. Yeah, the only one that is in play right now is in St. Paul. Currently, it's the only place in the state. Okay, so we'll move into the questions that were submitted via the regular Q&A. Um, so this one is similar to something you covered a little bit already, but if you want to go over it again. Again, this is another person who wished to remain anonymous, but they're asking, can my landlord force me to use a space heater if I pay the electric bill but not the heat?
I would say the issue is the furnace not doing the job. If the furnace isn't doing the job, then the furnace should be fixed. And if the landlord's solution to that is a space heater, then I think the landlord's got to cover those expenses. I don't like space heaters. I feel like they aren't very efficient. I feel like there's some questions about safety with them. I just don't feel great about them. And so I would want the furnace repaired. That's the more efficient thing to do. That's what's promised. Is not that I'd have to worry about, am I going to burn this place down? I don't know. That's just me, right? Like that's so. Yeah, I would run it through the what is the temperature without the space heater? Sort of is it 60? Is it below 60? Above 60? 14 days. That's how
Mhm.
I would approach it.
Okay. All right. Another anonymous question. How do these rules work with alternating temperatures? I think this is specifically for if the temperature is, if the rules kick in at a certain temperature. So if Monday and Tuesday it's 55 degrees in the house, then there's a warm Wednesday. Does that reset the timer for tenant requesting repairs?
Yeah, it makes filing it a real trick, right? And those shoulder seasons, those shoulder weeks are really difficult for this. And I don't think I have a really great answer. I can talk about other stuff that sort of relates to it. But it's really a difficult thing to bring the case. I mean, look, one way to look at it is if I filed an ETRA and I had grounds to do it when I filed it, then that case is valid, right? I shouldn't be penalized at the time of filing for filing it when it was legitimate. Also, it's difficult to take on the time and effort and money of filing a case. Like, that's a very difficult thing to take on. And that, I think, is one sort of downside of that variable regime, right? Is that some days it's in effect and some days it's not. That's a real downside with that method. And the temperature ebbs and flows, right? It was 80 degrees last weekend. It was 40 degrees a week before that. And it's just, the temperature just isn't a straight line, not in this state, probably not anywhere. Yeah.
Jim. Okay. Wendy just has a quick question. In an ETRA action, will the judge likely require that the rent be paid into the court in escrow?
I think they could. Yeah. And as a tenant, I think you can request that also. It isn't the default like it is for a rent escrow case, but I think you could ask for it.
So the judge could ask for it once they get the hearing, but they don't necessarily have to pay it when you go and file like you would for a rent escrow action.
Yep, that's right. And even in a rent escrow action, paying rent to court is sort of optional also. The statute only requires you pay rent to court as it comes owing. So that's a weird way to think about it. It's called a rent escrow action, right? And so, but the rent isn't really the big fish, right? The big fish is getting in front of the judge.
Yeah. Okay. And along similar lines, for low income people that can't afford the filing fees, what can be done?
Yep, you could file IFP. That's to file for the filing fee waiver. So both the filing fees can be waived if your income qualifies.
IFP stands for Informa Pauperis because there's nothing that the legal system likes better than an outdated Latin phrase, right?
we love outdated Latin phrases.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Sua sponte. We'll bring them up sua sponte.
That was the name of the improv group at my law school.
Oh no. Were they good?
Yeah, they were. I mean, sometimes they were good. Sometimes they were not. It's improv.
It's improv.
All right. Can Michael, who is I guess service provider here at Homeline, he wants to know, could you talk about building codes versus city or town ordinances?
I could try.
I think yeah, maybe together we can hammer that out.
I think the key difference with the key thing about a building code, I think, is that it sets out really particular rules about how a building should be constructed, right? How many studs per linear foot are required, right? How big of a window does it need to be a bedroom? Those are sort of the building codes that I think of. For a heat ordinance, it's just not quite as detailed, right? It deals in more of the sort of, if the temperature is this, then the temperature should be that, right? If a calendar says this, then it should say that. It really isn't concerned with how many cubic feet of attic space are required.
Yeah, like, and the building codes are about new construction, or if you're renovating or something like that. It's about
Yeah.
the here and now versus like, the home that was built in 1914 may have newspaper for insulation, and that's fine. Like, you don't have to go in and redo the
Yep.
insulation
Yep.
um, unless you're doing some renovation. So that's building code. There is statewide building code as well as city level building codes. And those can come into play for landlord tenant law, but for the most part, they don't touch our work too much. The city and town ordinances are going to be much more applicable to what a tenant is actually experiencing right now. Tenants really don't have to interact with building codes very much. That's really more of an owner and developer issue.
Mhm.
Um, so, oh, Michael is asking a clarifying question, but doesn't one say that the equipment must be capable of heating but not actually doing so? That's an ordinance. That's not a building code necessarily, unless
Yeah.
someone is installing a new furnace. So, and maybe we use those improper. Maybe we used building code to reference a furnace ordinance or a heat ordinance when we should not have. But
Yeah. But it's a good question, right? If I turn up the thermostat full blast, is it able to raise the temperature to what it should be? Can it do that?
mhm,
And if it cannot, then it cannot, right? How it's one thing if you can set thermostat at 68, but it can only warm it up to 65. If I set the thermostat to 72 and that gets up to 68, well, okay, that's a wonky thermostat and maybe a, a furnace that needs a little tweaking, but the temperature is correct for the code.
yeah. All right, we have one final question here. I think this is a really great one that kind of summarizes everything. Well, so another anonymous question, but they're saying this is all very confusing. I agree. Why 68 degrees treated differently in Rochester, Minneapolis? Shouldn't there be a state law?
Yeah, no, preparing for this really made me think a lot about what's the point of rules? Why do we have laws, right? And predictability, right? You want the law to be predictable so that you can know what to expect. You want it to be relatively uniform, right? So you can go from place to place and know what the rules are going to be. And right now, the heat rules are not that. They are unpredictable. They are not uniform. They aren't always so usable. And it really does mean looking at the city, municode.org, right, to look up the municipal ordinance yourself, or checking out our database and seeing what that particular city's ordinance is. And those are really good reasons to have a statewide heat code. What would that look like? This again made me think about ice fishing. That's kind of funny to think about, right? Why is this like ice fishing? There are the lakes close for ice fishing at different times. There are lakes up north that close later than the ones down south because the ice goes out. Would the heat code reflect that? I don't know if it should. Like that again, where does that go for predictability? Right, on one side of a highway, it's in effect. On the other side, it's not. That's not quite usable in the same way. Maybe the most usable version is this sort of always enforce, always needs to be able to heat up to 68. Maybe that's the best one. I don't know. That ultimately, I mean, is a legislative decision, and how they arrive at decisions is still a mystery to me.
Yeah. So yeah, it is what it is at this point. But again, talk to your legislative officials. I
Yeah,
think it's yeah, because I agree. It boggles my mind that like somewhere like, oh, I don't know, I don't even know off the top of my head, like, I don't know if Moorhead has a minimum or not. Like, I don't remember, but the fact that it might not.
Why not? It might not. Yeah.
Mhm,
It's just, if I'm a landlord trying to do business, I want the rules uniform across the state because then I know what to expect.
mhm,
If I'm a tenant, okay, because as a landlord, it's really easy to own properties in St. Paul and Minneapolis and Brooklyn Center and Roseville and Bloomington, right? Like these are all basically the same like geographic area, but those are, four cities out of this, and each with their own different regimes for rules. And so I would like one. I would like one so I can know without having to worry. Now, if I'm a tenant, I don't move around as much, right? I can only live one place, but still, like it would be nice to have just one rule to know.
mhm. Something that I think comes up often that's not here on this, but I think is a good thing to touch on is the cold weather rule. How does that
Yeah.
apply to being, either having, being forced out or what have you? It's not exactly the topic of heat, but I think it ties in.
Yeah. So I think of the cold weather rule as two things, the real one and the fake one. um, the fake one is that a landlord can't tell me to move out in winter. I hear once a week. I feel like I hear that about once a week. And that is not true. The landlord can most definitely give you a notice to vacate when it's cold out. A landlord can file an eviction when it's cold out. There is no restriction on temperature, um,
Unless
and
there's
time of
a
year.
clause in a lease.
Yeah, unless there's a clause in the lease. That's right. That's right. So that's the fake one. The real one has to do with a tenant vacating the premises during cold weather. Is that the tenant has to give notice that they're leaving, so that the landlord can take the steps to make sure the pipes don't freeze if the tenant leaves. And so that's the cold weather rule that's in effect. As far as utilities go, there is some rules surrounding utility companies not being able to shut off the utility during cold weather. Usually that involves the tenant trying to work, the tenant making a payment arrangement with the utilities, that the utility has to work with the tenant to make an arrangement, and then they can't shut off the utility so long as that's in play.
Absolutely. Um, I'm assuming the same anonymous person is asking ultimately, and this might not be a question that is the best for you or I, but might be something to forward on to Michael at our office. But ultimately, who do we think is the most responsible for making positive changes in this? It seems like very few people in power are supporting tenants, or we would have seen major changes by now.
Uh, yeah, that's a good one for Michael. I think I don't know the answer to that. Um,
One thing,
it's
mhm.
Yeah. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say, one thing that is good to keep in mind is that um, a legislature lists, want to hear from their constituents, right? So, if you've got your story, if you have a story that you need to or want to share about, your experience, then it's important to share. Like that's one of the things that is super important for folks to do is to, if you're comfortable sharing your story, then you should do that. Because that's going to have a much bigger impact than you would think, honestly. So we are currently here at Homeline collecting stories. So if you want to share your story with us so that we can share it with legislators in the upcoming 2023 legislative session, not season, session, uh, then you can go to our website. One of our policy interns wrote up a story explaining why it's important, how we use them, and then include a link to a Google Doc that you can use as a tenant to share what your experiences have been. So I highly recommend, if you are interested in doing that, to to go to that website that I just linked in the chat. Okay. And then Wendy is asking about CLE code. We don't have a CLE code right now. We can apply for one. I think that this is probably lawyery enough that this
I
would
think
be
so. Yeah, I think so.
that we can get some CLE credit for this going.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I will, but we'll email everybody once we have that code. Okay. So honestly, a lot of it ends up being up to the board and how long that takes. I cannot tell you. We've had varying experiences. But we don't have a CLE code at the moment. Okay, and that is it for the questions that have been submitted. If you've got a question, I'll give another minute or so to, if you want to type in furiously or something like that, go for it. Otherwise, again, if you've got questions, please, if you've got more specific questions or something that wasn't answered here, feel free to give us a call or drop us an email. Totally free service. We're happy to help as we can. So yeah, and again, I want to extend, Wendy says thank you, and I also want to say thank you, Matt, for presenting and putting this together and doing all the extra work with that video, which again will be on our website, and we'll probably be sharing it around our social medias. It will include sound.
I hope so.
It
It
will.
will. It
It
was
will.
fun. It was fun to do this. It was fun to make the video. It's a fun. I love it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. We will be having another webinar next month. So we should be having a landlord attorney who represents landlords will be coming to do a presentation and mostly a Q&A session. So if you've got questions specifically for landlords attorneys, feel free to join us next month. That information will be coming out shortly on
That'll
how
be
to register
interesting.
for that. So thank you all for showing up today, and you have a good rest of your day. Bye.